Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Chair Eisenberg. I will also give you your choice. I had comments on Chapters 3 and Chapters 4, and I'm not sure whether it would be appropriate for me to share a preview of those now or wait until you reach those chapters.
I would share. I would share the stuff.
Then I won't ask twice.
Okay.
A couple of quick comments on those chapters, and in a number of places, I think there are places where you've made real progress, but have a little bit farther to go. I'll start with defining water supply reliability, Chapter 3, and I think the relevant pages there are pages 68 and 69 of Chapter 3.
68, 69.
And I don't have those pages in front of me, but I think I have the right pages.
That's correct.
Yep. And I wanted to start by pointing out that on page 68, there is there's a definition of reliability. At the bottom of page 69, there's a discussion of predictability, which we think is a really key factor. That is a key item in the discussion, but it's not actually in that sidebar that discusses how do you measure reliability. So I think a lot of the key concepts are there, and I'm going to distinguish between two concepts. First is water supply reliability in terms of delta exports, where I think some of the key concepts are there: resiliency and predictability, and the idea of more in wet years, less in dry years. I think those are key concepts, but I think I would recommend that you push it a little farther to be more clear about what those metrics are. And in particular, I was really struck that predictability, which we think is a key concept, is at the tail end of that discussion, not in that sidebar. We were concerned that even though the concept was there, it needs to be highlighted as a key metric for how you measure predictability of delta exports.
And it's only relevant to delta exports in your judgment?
Well, it's relevant for any water user. The predictability of supply from all sources is important.
Okay.
But I was going to distinguish between two concepts, if I could. First is predictability of delta exports. And I think you've got a lot of the right concepts in there. Less in dry, more in wet, predictability, resiliency. I think you can sharpen those up to be more clear metrics. The second concept is delivery reliability. And I think the pieces are there. If you are a water user, you can increase the reliability of your deliveries by tools that aren't just year-to-year deliveries from the Delta. And what I mean by that is in a dry year. So the last 2 years are a great example. We had a wet year followed by a dry year. In that wet year, we put a substantial amount of water in storage. And in the subsequent dry year, the water users have water from three sources. They have water they receive from the Delta. It's less in a dry year. Water they stored in the previous year, that wet year. And investments in alternative supplies. So those, I think, are key concepts. The first is, how do you measure reliability in terms of delta exports alone, delta exports in isolation? And those concepts, predictability, reliability, predictability, resiliency, and the big gulp, little sip concept, I think are key elements of defining delta reliability. But to the extent that you're looking at statewide delivery reliability, taking into account more than just what you get from the Delta on a year-to-year basis, I think that concept of delivery reliability has to have three components. What you get from the Delta in a given year, what you stored from the previous wet years, and your investments in regional supplies. So I'll stop there. That's my first point about defining reliability, where I think a lot of the concepts are there but could be sharpened up as real metrics.
Randy.
Barry, do you think that the staff has made a strong enough connection between this predictability concept and the need for adequate storage in wet years to facilitate flows in supply in dry years?
I would put that in the second category. I think predictability, I've been thinking predictability in terms of being able to look at the Delta, look at different year types, look at different conditions, and know what you're going to get from the Delta in those years. So less possibly a facility, certainly investments in delta levees, science-based operating criteria, so you know that they're likely to be in place. A healthier ecosystem means fewer surprises. Those all help give increased predictability of deliveries on a year-to-year basis. But as a water user at the end of the pipe, storage in a wet year gives you greater predictability of deliveries in a dry year. But those deliveries, we often forget in the discussion we're having right now that we're seeing the big gulp little sip concept right now. We stored a lot of water 2 years ago. We're now going through a much drier year, and we're living off of that storage. I tend to think that that's not the same as predictability of exports on a year-to-year basis, that's more delivery reliability, reflecting that multi-year carryover.
So in terms of the delivery reliability, do you think that the sixth staff draft has made an adequate connection between the need for additional storage?
No, I think it should be clear. And that distinction between reliability of delta deliveries sort of on a year-to-year basis and predictability of deliveries and the role south of delta storage could play in that, I think that definitely should be more clear. There really is a difference between being able to predict what you'll get from the delta in a given year and the ultimate reliability of your supplies given all of your sources. So the first concept. The second is with regard to turning to Chapter 3, the discussion of habitat. And I'm sorry, I don't have these page numbers in front of me right now. You have a decision of habitat restoration.
Barry, let me go back to your first subject.
Sure.
You looked at what I thought was a pretty provocative and interesting idea on page 108 at the top, which is a delta water delivery predictability and suggesting an index. And I understand it's a concept only, but there's just something awfully intriguing about trying to be upfront, informative, and realistic about this water business that seems to be based on a lot of other things as well. And did you have any reaction to this notion of an index or some approach to that?
I like the idea. I think the important thing is to distinguish between two concepts. The first is predictability of exports, reliability of exports and what that means. Because we tend to think of that on a year-to-year basis. So a healthier ecosystem means fewer surprises. Fewer levee failures means more predictability. A facility could mean that. Mm-hmm. We tend to think of it in those terms, but your charge is to help contribute to statewide reliability, and there are other factors there. Carryover storage is one, from wet to drier, and another is investment in alternative supplies. So I think defining those two concepts, what does increasing the reliability of delta exports mean? And what does it mean to increase the reliability ultimately of deliveries? Those really are two. They're related, but they're not the same.
All right. I'm sorry, I interrupted you on the ecosystem stuff.
Please do. Second concept is habitat. There's a discussion of habitat restoration in there, and I simply wanted to point out that there is, we would recommend, as you're looking at your discussion of certainty and uncertainty, that you draw attention to the fact that we have greater levels of certainty for different kinds of habitat restoration. I was just looking at the National Research Council's statements that are very clear, and the recent documents in BDCP prepared by Fish and Game and I think Fish and Wildlife all say the same thing, and that is we have a high degree of confidence that we're going to see real biological response from floodplain restoration, but that there's a great deal of uncertainty with regard to the benefits of tidal marsh restoration for a variety of reasons. And we'd recommend that that your plan distinguish between those two, distinguish between the two in terms of the certainty of benefits, because I think what it calls for, it doesn't mean you don't do tidal marsh restoration, but it means that there's probably going to be a greater call for adaptive management done early on to make sure that we're making smart investments there. We don't get 10 years into a program and find out that we've made not enough investment in this kind of restoration that works well and too much in this other one that doesn't give us what we hoped it might. So the request really is to make sure you're distinguishing between floodplain and tidal marsh with regard to the certainty of likely benefits.
Are your folks ready yet to opine on whether for the first 25 or 30 years we should predominantly emphasize habitat, floodplain, and non-tidal? I mean, what I'm looking for is kind of a generalized rule out there that might apply.
As a generalized rule, as we look at the agency comments, independent science comments, the National Research Council, the short answer is yes. The short answer is it looks as though we've got a lot of certainty that we can plan for a substantial amount of floodplain restoration. That's not a trivial thing to do, but we've got a fair amount of certainty around that. The NRC said that very clearly. And our approach, we're not recommending that we downscale our long-term ambitions for tidal marsh restoration. We're not opposed to ambitious tidal marsh restoration, but the right approach, we think, is to make sure that very early on we design projects that are probably going to be smaller than the initial floodplain projects might be, and study the heck out of them and figure out if those are the right investments. Because right now, we don't know.
Could I ask you to be good enough to put a concept in writing, not a detailed thing, but just a page or two that we could post on the web, circulate to the council members? Because it's my instinct is as we get closer to the end, it's this kind of a public policy determination based on the best information we have of where possibly emphasis might start, not where it ends, but where it might start based on the judgment. And I'd like to be clear in my mind what it is you
mean in terms of the approach to habitat restoration?
Yes. I'm not opposed to something comparable on your first reliability issues, but certainly on the latter. But I want to make sure I understand it correctly.
Happy to do that. Third point, on you have a discussion on page 131 of delta flows and what they what they mean. And there were 4 points I wanted to make when I looked at them. The first is a very simple one. And it took me a while to realize that the discussion on 131 is really a discussion just of delta inflow and outflow. Delta flows obviously include more than just that. They include the cross delta flows that are discussed in the graphic on page 130. And it took me a while to realize that the discussion on 131 doesn't include some of the other delta flow issues that are addressed in that graphic on 130. So the recommendation would be probably the right thing to do is to expand that discussion on 131 to make it clear that there are a variety of flow criteria, flow characteristics that are important. One is delta inflow, one is delta outflow, and another are the interior channel flows that are discussed on page 130. And that issue, the reason that's so important is that the issue about flows within the delta are pretty much unrelated to whether you adopt an unimpaired flows approach or not. That's just not, an unimpaired flows approach doesn't resolve those questions about reverse flows and OMR river flows and so forth. So it's, I think, a really important idea to capture because the debate about unimpaired flows isn't a debate about what to do about old and middle river flows, because no matter what you do with an unimpaired flows metric, it doesn't address that issue. So that's the first simple concept, that the debate on page 131 is really a portion of the flows debate, not the entirety of it. And I wanted to make sure that was captured right now. It took me a while to realize that distinction. The second point, again, is a simple one. The language on 131 recommends an emphasis on functions instead of an unimpaired flow approach. And the NRC has essentially endorsed, certainly on the lower San Joaquin River, an unimpaired flows approach. And your independent science board had high praise to say about the NRC's report. So
that was in the letter today and their letter to the water board as
exactly
well.
Right. Yep. So it looks to us as though the scientific advice you're getting is that an unimpaired flows approach is a sound one, and that, of course, is the approach the state board took. So,
but it's an unimpaired flow approach to start with. It is not the ending point.
Yeah.
And And that's, everybody, the fear, of course, is if you start high.
And we agree with that.
I understand.
I want to point out this exact chart was included with our letter to the state board, and that Dr. Norgard confirmed today what I understood, that they don't see a conflict between this chart and what they said in their letter, and I don't see a conflict. I think what they said in their letter is consistent with this. So I understand the nuances there, and they were careful with their language, and I'm trying to be careful with mine.
Joe, when you say the chart, can you just tell me which page you're at so I can go back and double check that?
131? Is it 131? The one that you said, the one that says more natural functional flow.
Okay.
Was actually an attachment to our letter.
Oh, I see. Okay.
To the state board, and the independent science board, I think, was comfortable with that letter. Certainly, we had scientists involved in drafting that letter, and they felt it was not inconsistent with their letter.
Well, let me ask then two questions, because I'm not sure exactly how the approach on 131 addresses these two concerns. The first is one of our concerns about a narrow approach to ecosystem functions as opposed to an unimpaired flows approach is that a functional approach always leaves us a little bit behind. There are always mechanisms we don't understand, causalities we don't fully understand. An unimpaired approach captures some of those mechanisms. And one of our concerns is if the approach is narrowly on ecosystem functions, then we may lose essential benefits simply because we don't understand the mechanisms yet.
I guess so. My perception is that this does not limit us and say you can't and shouldn't use unimpaired flow, so that you get the variability, for example. That's the key thing that the Independent Science Board talked about, is wanting a variability that is more natural. And it seems to us that that is a function, and that should be included. And so using unimpaired flows could work.
Right, because you still get that variability.
You still get the variability, and that is part of the functional flow regime. And I'm not a scientist, so I probably need to have Lauren here to help me if you're going to have a real technical question.
Well, I'll go back and look at that language, and we may recommend that you clarify that, because we want to make sure we don't lose the benefits of an unimpaired flows approach, even though we fully recognize it's not the end of the debate.
What I'd also ask you to do is start on page 126, which is the start of the focus discussion on delta flows generically. And, I follow your previous comments. I'd like to look at language, but somehow all these pages work together into a much more, I think, sophisticated and scientifically consistent approach than we had in previous versions. And I just, before we vary it, because the scientists have essentially said, yeah, we kind of like what you're saying right now, I want to make sure I know what the argument is, the issues is, and so on. But I'd ask you to look at it in the large context. It feels pretty good to me now in this form. Now, I'm open to arguments, but it feels like we're close to a legitimate and fair statement of the flow issue.
And given where part of our recommendations are clearly that you should clarify your discussion, because I realized only after I'd read that box about delta flows a couple of times that I realized, you've addressed these other delta flow issues over here. So it took me a little while to sort those out. So that's, I think, a point of clarification. The second point of clarification there is to make sure that it's clear that an unimpaired flows approach makes some sense, but it's not the end of the debate. There are additional issues you need to consider. Cross delta flows are one of those. There may be critical ecosystem functions that don't lend themselves to a simple percentage approach. You may want to protect certain functions in a way that might be different from what you do simply through a percentage approach. And the last point I wanted to make, and again, this is one of the advantages to an ecosystem approach, we've seen some real unintended consequences from the current regulatory approach, because the approach we currently have has some big step functions in terms of changes in X2 requirements and changes of EI, the export inflow ratio requirements. So there are big differences between January and February or June and July. And what it means is that the system's being managed differently from how we thought it would be managed, because water users understandably try to optimize the system, and they recognize, wait a minute, if I delay my releases by a month, I can pump much more of it a month from now, or the standards will be different a month from now. And that's led to changes that we didn't anticipate when those were modeled. And I think that's always a risk with a clumsy approach to functionality-based regulation, because you can wind up with these big step functions that result in opportunities to game the system or just lead to unintended consequences. And we think there's less of a risk of that, of unintended consequences, the more grounded you are in an unimpaired flows approach, where it's pretty straightforward how the system's going to be operated, and you don't have these huge step functions from the 31st of one month to the 1st of the next. Those were the quick recommendations I had, and we'll certainly follow up with letters with comments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Pat, do we